So the first one is psychodynamic therapy. Now psychodynamic therapy was initially laid down by Sigmund Freud. Later on, his successor Carl Jung also followed with the concept of psychodynamic therapy, but it was analytical psychodynamic therapies. However, the later followers of Sigmund Freud, who were known as Neo Freudians, also established their own unique versions of this classical psychodynamic therapy. Now, this psychodynamic therapy involves understanding the internal conflict, the internal psyche of a person, and resolve the issues that are internal to a person. So, this psychodynamic therapy works in 3 stages. In the first stage, the client becomes familiar with the routine process of the relation with the therapist, what are the things, and tries to recollect all the superficial material into the conscious state of mind, that is, into the unconscious state of the mind. So let's say a person could be unconsciously worried about something and the person is actually not aware why there is certain change in the behavior which is seen, and that is the thing which is happening in the back of the mind, the unconscious mind. So, under a psychodynamic approach, the first thing is to bring those unconscious things into the conscious mind so that the client knows what the problem is. The second stage is the actual modality of treatment, where there is firstly the transference, then the phase of resistance, and then a phase of interference. We would understand all these 3 in a while, so don't worry. So there is the second stage where do you have the modality of the treatment, and the last stage is where finally the issues are resolved and the relation between the client and the therapist is over, and the client is now ready to leave the therapy happily, getting rid of all the problems. So those are the 3 stages under which a psychodynamic therapy works. So as we said, under this psychodynamic therapy, there are 2 important components. First is the free association and the second is dream interpretation. So free association and dream interpretation form the basis of psychotherapy. What are those? Free association is very simple. The person is asked to relax, and when the person is asked to lay down and relax, the person starts to speak out whatever comes to the mind. So the person is given a peaceful, healing atmosphere where they constantly try to get themselves relaxed, and whatever comes to their mind is being said. As a result, all those things that were unconsciously in the mind of the client are being revealed, and these are being taken into account by whom? Definitely by the therapist. So this is a method of free association. To summarize again, under free association, free flow of ideas, desires, anything that is running into the unconscious mind is allowed. The person is into a very relaxed state, and therefore therapist is able to comprehend what the actual problem is regarding. Once the therapist gains this information, the therapy actually becomes easier. Not only this, when the client is brought into consciousness, the client is then asked to mark down whatever has come in the dreams. This could be simply by drawing symbols, simply by drawing images, or whatsoever they have seen or witnessed when they were lying down. And this process is known as dream interpretation. Later on, these symbols and these things are being analyzed by the therapist. The therapist tries to understand why certain symbols, certain images have been drawn by the client. Now, this is a more practical way. Why? Sometimes it so happens, consciously or unconsciously, the client won't speak everything. But when it comes to drawing, or marking as symbols, they would mark because there is no issue of ego there. And as a result, dream interpretation becomes better or more successful, and therefore dream interpretation is more preferred. So there are indicators which explain an unfulfilled desire. For example, let's say person wakes up and draws a car. So probably when the therapist would talk more, the therapist could understand that the person has a strong desire to probably buy a car but is unable to buy a car, and therefore that was part of the dream. So there is how those unfulfilled desires could be interpreted through the process of dream interpretation. So two important methods under psychodynamic approach. I repeat again, first is free association, where free flow of ideas, desires, whatever comes into unconscious mind is being brought. The second is those are being drawn as symbols, as diagrams, and being interpreted by the therapist, and this is dream interpretation. So free association and dream interpretation, two important elements. Now, what is the process? How it actually takes place? What is the modality of treatment? The first is transference. Transference is the process where the client starts to identify the therapist. Now this identification or association could be of various ways. It could be positive, it could be negative. We'll understand in a while how. So let's say the person is lying down and having free association. Now, since the therapist is non-judgmental, the person, the client, can actually develop a positive feeling, a feeling of being very close to the therapist, considering them as a parental figure. It could be a motherly figure, a fatherly figure, and discussing the ideas very naturally. There could be another scenario. The another scenario could be this person is totally against me. So there would be a huge resistance that would be created. Now, this resistance, as I said, can come consciously, where a person thinks, no, this person is definitely deliberately trying to do my harm, so I'll hide something. So this is conscious. There could be unconscious phenomena where the person who is not having that much thought that I should hide but still is hiding. So this resistance could be conscious or unconscious. The transference could be a positive transference or a negative transference. When the therapist becomes a substitute for the person in present, let's say it could be mother, it could be father, it could be any person whom the client is very close to, this process is known as transference neurosis. So transference neurosis is a process where the therapist becomes a substitute for the person in the present, and this is known as transference neurosis. Very, very important to understand. Now, once there is certain kind of arrangement that is done, as I said, it could be a positive arrangement where the person develops a very close attachment to the therapist and is ready to share the problems, then it is totally fine. Still, if there is a negative transference and a resistance, the therapist would take in all efforts to interpret. Now, what is the next stage? Definitely, if the therapist is trying to interpret, the next stage is interpretation. Now, this interpretation would come with two things. Two things are confrontation and clarification. Confrontation basically occurs when therapist's point of view to the client is not actually accepted by the client. So there is confrontation. A simple confrontation between two siblings on a piece of chocolate probably. You would eat or I would eat. So that is a kind of simple confrontation. So the therapist points out to the client the kind of psyche that must be faced by the client. So sometimes the client would be ready to hear that. Sometimes the client would not be ready to hear that. If it is a positive transference, the client would be ready to hear that. If it is a negative transference, there would be resistance. So confrontation is important to understand. The next is Clarification. Clarification is the stage where therapist actually brings in a clear picture of the confusing event. So what is confusing for the client is actually not confusing for the therapist. The therapist, who is external to the happenings, is able to externally view and analyze why the things are running like this, and it appears like a movie. So, the therapist has a much clear picture about what would be the next stage, but the person who is in dilemma, who is in a state of stress, anxiety, would not be able to understand why this is happening in so and so fashion. So, this clarification is to be brought, and this is being brought by the therapist. Once the clarification is brought, there is repeated process of understanding the process of clarification, confrontation, clarification, confrontation, and this is what is known as walking through. So, the therapist would walk through with the client with a series of confrontation and clarification. Every few sessions, the therapist would have to explain that this is a confusing event, remove it. This is a positive event, incorporate it, and this would constantly go on. So this is walking through. Once with the process of walking through is done, insight is the outcome. Now, understand that this insight is not all of the sudden. It is not similar to the insight that we have learned in the section on learning. There it was all of the sudden aha feeling. So let's say a monkey is able to get the bananas from the roof by joining the rods together and creating a longer rod through which the bananas could be captured, and a feeling of joy. It's not that insight here. Here, the insight is slow and gradual. The unconscious memories are repeatedly brought into the conscious mind of the person, and these unconscious memories, when they are repeatedly brought into the conscious mind of the person, the emotional and the intellectual level of understanding is resolved. So slowly the irrational behavior, the irrational patterns are removed, and there is a willingness to change, a willingness to get emotionally stronger and create an emotional insight. So the outcome of this psychotherapy is an emotional insight, diving into oneself much more deeper and much more clearer. So that is how psychodynamic therapies work. As we said, two important components under psychodynamic therapy are free association and dream interpretation, and then the modality of treatment is such that there is the transference followed by resistance, interpretation, walking through, and finally a insight, and that is a emotional insight. It is a slow and gradual process of diving into the unconscious state of mind and getting or transferring those unconscious things into the conscious mind, walking through the problems and developing a strong emotional insight.